Welcome to the Production Talk podcast with me, Yarn of mixartist.com.au. In this podcast series, we celebrate the modern way of producing music. We want to talk about all things related to songwriting, recording at home, and music production. So if you produce your music at home, this is the place to be. Please subscribe and recommend this podcast to all your friends. This is the Production Talk podcast, episode 39. Welcome back to another episode of the Production Talk podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Before we start today's interview, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that the following interview is taking place on. It's the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today with me is my dear friend of many years, decades, James Lyall. And I'm very thankful that you found time to meet me today. Thank you for being aboard, James.
Thanks very much, Jan. Pleasure to be on the podcast. We've talked about it for a while.
Yeah, exactly.
And here we are.
And finally, we found some time. You know, we've got a coffee going. We've got the recording system going. So, James, the reason why I really wanted to talk to you is because you're an absolute specialist when it comes to EDM production, which, in all honesty, is a field that I do not consider myself a specialist in any way. So I really hope that you bring some interesting things to the table today. But at the same time, you're also extremely knowledgeable in all kinds of other genres. So now you've recorded yourself acoustically, vocals and guitar. You produced metal and you play metal and EDM. It's the entire spectrum. So you cover a range that I don't. So first, maybe just tell us about your musical projects, what they are like, and your musical story and your musical career highlights, please.
Cool. All right, where do we begin there? That's a big question. So yeah, I guess diversity is always something that I've kind of been very sort of keen on in terms of not only what I produce, but what I listen to as well. So like you mentioned there, my sort of background in production sort of started off in the studio realm, working with metal bands over in Glasgow. And that's really all my sort of what my main focus was when I first started getting into music production. That's all I really wanted to do was metal and work with hardcore bands, all different sort of subgenres of metal, grindcore, death metal. Glasgow had a burgeoning scene at the time that I was sort of getting into music production. So a lot of my friends used to come in and we used to record in the studios in SE Glasgow, and that's kind of where I really sort of fell in love with just the environment of the studio and obviously the process of capturing music and that sort of thing. And then over time, I guess a reflection of my musical tastes. I've always been into stuff like drum and bass. Sort of my earliest sort of musical tastes, I guess, were centered around old school rave music as well. When I was sort of in my early teens, that's when I sort of became aware of things like amen breaks and 303 bass lines and 808 kick drums. Obviously, not really knowing what they were called, but having this very, very sort of immersion in that realm as a kid. As at the same time as still listening to stuff like rock and metal and a lot of pop music back then as well. Michael Jackson's always been one of my favorite artists. Since
I was a huge Michael Jackson fan as a teenager.
Yeah, and I guess Michael Jackson, that's where my awareness of music production started. It was actually age 5 when my mum bought me a copy of Thriller, and I remember listening to it on my old little personal stereo that my sister got me, and just being aware of things like panning and even things like sampling. I was just immediately sort of drawn into this sonic world on the headphones when I heard that first song on Thriller, which is "Wanna Be Starting Something," and hearing all the little voices and these little overdub layers. I was like, what is this stuff,
Well, Quincy's production is just ridiculously
phenomenal.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And I think
it doesn't get any better.
It doesn't. Yeah. So I think that's maybe where I first was I suppose aware of production. Was hearing these little details in the music that I'd only really picked out on headphones. So I had that sort of pop upbringing and rock upbringing as well. But again, at school, all my mates in class were like handing out copies of rave tapes that their big brothers were, I suppose, getting from who were a little bit older, were sort of circulating to their wee brothers, and we'd copy cassettes of all these different DJ mixes and all this kind of stuff, and that's I think where I sort of really started to get involved. Obviously I was a little bit too young to go clubbing and this kind of stuff, but the dance music culture of the UK definitely started to permeate permeate a lot of my sort of musical taste when I was probably about 13 and 14. So a few years later, when I started being able to afford to actually go out and buy music and stuff, I started getting into stuff like drum and bass. And I think a lot of the musical features of certain electronic styles and stuff like metal are quite kind of similar as well. So myself and my friends, we had quite a broad sort of taste in music, but we're definitely sort of into sort of industrial music, metal that use synths, as well as pure electronic music as well. And obviously a bit of a fusion of both of those worlds. But yeah, basically that's kind of where I started, I guess, was getting into early forms of jungle, drum and bass. What would be called sort of rave music back then. And then years later, as I started to get into metal production, I also started to experiment with working with things like hardware samplers, EMU samplers, the old Akai S2000s, various different sound modules, sort of hardware synths, and just started tinkering, I guess, with some very bad sort of takes on electronic music when I first started producing. But at that stage, it was all about just having fun and experimenting and learning about sampling and this kind of thing.
Cool. And you also play the guitar.
Yes.
And I've seen you slapping a bass.
Yes.
And you've got a drum set at home.
Yeah,
is that
I play
right?
drums as well. Yeah.
So you're pretty much an entire production facility,
pretty
sort
much
of in one person.
Yeah. Again, being self-taught, my on a sort of technical level, my technical musicianship skills are passable. Obviously, I've learned how to use the studio.
You're too hard on yourself.
Well, the thing is, I hang out with a lot of pretty elite musicians, so I'm always sort of comparing myself to them. Guys that can literally, are virtuosos at their instruments. So when I compare myself on a sort of musical level, I always am quite self-effacing, I guess, in that regard. But I'm definitely serviceable as a musician in terms of being able to get stuff down and using production to I guess, sort of correct things that need to be corrected. And a little bit of assistance is sometimes required on an editing level. But I am definitely getting more confident with stuff like that. But yeah, I love it all, mate. Love it all. Love playing bass. Guitar was my sort of second instrument. I originally started with piano.
Yep.
When I was a young child, gradually sort of got into guitar in my late teens. So that's I guess my main instrument is guitar. But I've dabbled with pretty much everything: drums, bass, vocals.
Well,
yeah,
cool. And when you produce a certain genre, is that the only thing on your mind, or do your thoughts and production workflows get sort of cross-pollinate? What's the word?
Cross-pollinate.
Cross-pollinated from the other genres that you are also very experienced in? Is this EDM somewhere in the back of your mind when you produce metal, and vice versa?
It's a great question. Not really these days. And I guess that's because I've just got so many different projects on the go that are all quite different aesthetically. And in terms of the genre, I feel that it kind of has to be one or the other in terms of what I'm sort of feeling on any given day. So usually I tend to sort of operate in phases in terms of what I'm producing. So for example, about 6 months ago, I was really, really pushing the sort of metal stuff. I've got a couple of different solo projects on the go there. And that was my real focus at that particular point in time. And I think that was really a reflection of my headspace at that time. And that's something I think I've always been acutely aware of, is the relationship between how you're feeling mentally and emotionally and obviously what that can result in on a creative level. So at that particular point in time, I was feeling quite dark and I had a lot of stuff that I guess I was trying to process. And of course, metal is a phenomenal genre for catharsis, as you know yourself.
Yes.
So I tend to go in phases. Usually I can sort of tell on a given day like what I'm sort of feeling in terms of emotional stuff or sort of just mindset stuff or headspace stuff, and then obviously find some sort of musical vibe that relates to that. So there are days where I definitely don't feel like making metal or listening to metal at all, and I want to do something that's very, very relaxing. So those days I tend to work on my dub techno project, which goes by the name of Lost Inventions. That's pushing much more sort of ambient, much sort of deeper, more meditative forms of techno. And that's obviously a massive contrast aesthetically to something like the black metal stuff that I produce under the name Swathes. So yeah, very, very different vibes, different flavors. And I feel sort of lucky now where I'm able to kind of almost wake up in the morning and kind of feel feel something in my belly, like I can feel like I've got a drum and bass line in there brewing, or maybe an idea for a riff or something, so usually I can kind of tell what's going to be a good use of time, because obviously, as you know, time is very precious when you've got other things on the boil, and I definitely work in phases. So at the moment I'm kind of going back to my original project, which is Third Eye, which is my most established project. I haven't released anything under that name for a long time now, so I've been piecing together a bit of a comeback EP, working with some former collaborators and some new collaborators that I'm very, very excited about. So that's sort of taking up my time at the moment, as well as another collaborative project with a very good friend of mine in the UK, which I'm really excited about. We've been working on that for about 2 or 3 years now, 2 years, just working on pre-production, and we still haven't got a release out yet. We've just been sort of trying things out and trying to find the right representation of our evolving sound, I guess. No matter how I'm feeling, I guess the long and the short of it is I've always got some sort of music that reflects that. And I guess that's why I like to produce so many styles.
Fantastic. Well, that gives you a huge palette to draw from.
Yes.
And now, as you go through all these different productions, some of them are typically done in collaboration, looking at band projects and so on. But some of the EDM work is often just done all by oneself, as a single person. And then you have collaborations going. Which one is easier? Dealing with people and, all the pros and cons? Or sometimes being just by yourself and producing music that way?
It's a great question. It kind of varies, I guess. Just to cut straight to it, one thing I love about doing collaborations is often not having to mix the track down at the end of the project. So if I'm working, for example, with my good friend Sapphire, who's a very close friend and a producer who I've sort of almost kind of grown up with, and we've worked together on a number of different things. Like we've produced a number of different tracks. He tends to do the mix down, and obviously the fact that he's fantastic at mix downs, it always means that I often don't have to worry about that final mix, which is great. So that's the lazy answer, I guess. Cool. But obviously sometimes I end up doing the final mixes on other collaborations, so it does vary. I'm a bit of I do tend to work very well in isolation, but I also am pretty adept at working with other people, both in the flesh and also remotely. Most of my collaborations for the Third Eye project were done remotely, purely because of geography. So working with producers in America, working with producers in Canada, New Zealand, this kind of thing in the UK. So there isn't really an option there. A lot of the stuff does have to be done sort of asynchronously and offline, which is essentially like working in isolation anyway, really, because you're sort of adding a layer of new elements or refining arrangements or mixes or whatever, and then sending it back. So you're only ever sort of working by yourself anyway, even though it is a collaborative process. I tend to find that I think I'm more productive when I am in that sort of sense, that sort of isolated space. I have done sort of traditional collaborations with using a sort of hot seat system where you sort of take it in turns, and often I feel that that's maybe not as effective in certain situations. I guess it depends on who you're working with and this kind of stuff. And if I'm working with vocalists, I generally prefer to be in the studio doing the recording, doing the coaching through the takes, and sort of contributing to the performance aspect as well. But for things like just producing collaborative tracks, I tend to find that I work better by myself, I think, to be honest with you. And there's a number of different reasons why that might be the case, I guess. So,
well, the good news is, we have all the options these days.
Yes.
And, working remotely is so much more acceptable than it was, 5 years ago. If there's maybe one positive thing we can all draw from COVID is that we all get really good at remote collaboration.
Remote collaborations, which again, I've been doing since probably 2009. I think I did my first sort of online collaboration. So I think for many of us, we've always sort of had that as part of our sort of schedules. Yeah.
When you work remotely with somebody else, what system do you follow? Do you both use the same DAW? Do you exchange session files, or do you export WAV files with the same start point? Or
good question.
What's the least painful workflow there?
good. It's a really good question, particularly if you are thinking about getting into online collaboration as an artist. That's a really good question to ask. Is what's the best way of actually managing the logistical side of it? For me, it depends on who I'm working with. The majority of producers that I've worked with in the past don't use the same DAW, and again, things like plugins. You have to be very careful that everyone's got the same sort of compatibility with certain plugins that you might use that might be part of your signature sound as well, and thus are obviously really important as part of that production process. So I've done it in different ways. Most of the collaborations that I've done over the years have been just using stems, because most of the producers that I've worked with have been using different DAWs and different plugins and things. So stems basically just completely like safeguards that whole passing back and forth process.
Yeah, right. The listeners might have a little déjà vu moment now. When you refer to stems today, it's always good to ask what people actually mean by stems, whether it's the subgroup signals or the individual signals. Which one do you refer to there?
Combination of both.
A combination of both, yeah.
So certain things like obviously bass drum, snare drums, main vocals, I will always separate those. Other things that might be sort of, I suppose, convoluted in the way that they've been layered might end up getting stemmed out. I kind of treat it as, what are the individual entities within the music? For example, if I've got some sort of ambient section with 5 or 6 different pad sounds that are all layered together on different synths, different channels, for example, I sort of think about what would the collaborator want to do with these things. And for sort of minor elements, grouping stuff together is often a massive time saver. But obviously the sort of main ingredients I will always separate, just so that the end user's got kick and snare, that kind of thing. Even down to things like individual hi-hats, they might want to change the swing on things like hi-hats, so they need access to those things. So it really depends on the track. Each track I guess would be different there. With my collaborative project with my friend in the UK, that's one that we've sort of standardized our systems. So we actually decided, as part of that pre-production process, we decided on all the tools we were going to need in terms of third-party plugins, and we've basically standardized our setup so that we've got exactly the same array of plugins and stuff to draw from. And most of the time, we're working with Ableton Live for that project, so most of the time we're just sort of sticking with all the sort of stock Ableton effects and this kind of thing, which are fantastic. Yeah,
they're all really good.
They're really, really good. So with that project, we're actually sending the entire Ableton session back and forth, but I normally wouldn't do that with producers that I haven't worked with before, because it can potentially open up a bit of a Pandora's box of problems down the tracks. So but that was a conversation we had right at the start. We said, listen, what's the best way to give us that flexibility? And it's just standardizing our setups, I guess, is the way to go about that.
Yeah, well said. So what we really can take from it is that, the conversation needs to happen.
Yes.
If you collaborate, you need to speak about this ideally early on.
Exactly. There needs to be a system and a framework. For sure.
And, you need to agree on things like sample rate, and certain aspects need to be, that makes sense.
Exactly,
cool. Look, I would like to steer the conversation towards EDM production, if that's okay. Yeah. So we really need to speak about MIDI.
Yes.
And I think you and we've been in the industry for a long time, so the typical MIDI studio has changed a lot. Today it can be a USB keyboard and a laptop and headphones, while we both remember the times when there was lots of output gear, when people needed to know about MIDI interfaces, the DIN connectors, star networks versus daisy chaining, what a MIDI out is in comparison to MIDI through. Is any of this sort of older knowledge still useful to you these days when you produce?
Great question again. Absolutely is. Particularly within the dub techno production sort of approach that I'm currently working with, which is predominantly driven by hardware. So this project, Lost Inventions, was essentially a custom-built project that was designed to break my perfectionism, which is something that's basically...
You could explain that.
Yeah, so with music production, I'm sort of... always conflicted when it comes to a lot of sort of production aspects, and the biggest one for me is always things like mix down quality and this kind of stuff. And as a sort of dubstep producer and a drum and bass producer, because the production standards within those genres have reached such sort of sort of very, very high points, particularly within drum and bass production. Sort of early 2000s, that really became almost like a competition in many sort of production aspects and stuff. I definitely found that, who's got the fattest snare, the loudest mix down, all this kind of stuff, and the production quality within drum and bass is exceptionally high, similar to something like metal. Drum and bass producers are really, really, really gifted when it comes to audio engineering and advanced processing and this kind of thing. And it actually turned me into a bit of a nervous wreck when it came to sort of producing stuff and mixing things. And I've got a little bit of OCD when it comes to sort of a lot of sort of production stuff. So I found that I was getting very frustrated with this sort of perfectionistic tendency that I developed just from years and years and years of producing stuff that just had very, very high production quality.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
So of course, I can relate to that a lot.
Yeah, you almost become obsessive with certain things.
Then it can really be in your way. Then there's this saying that goes along the lines of, perfect is the opposite of done.
Yeah.
So we all need to accept that a production needs to be released at some stage, and there's always something left that could have been done.
Yes.
Does it have to be?
A track is never finished, is it?
It's never finished. Yeah. It's only ever abandoned.
Yeah. So that basically resulted in a situation where actually we sort of talked about this in passing the other day, didn't we? The fact that actually a lot of the music that I've made I haven't released, and that is obviously the last thing that you want as a producer. Why haven't I released it? Is it related to perfectionism? It definitely is, to an extent, particularly with the drum and bass side of things, particularly with the dubstep side of things. And I've got no reason to feel these things because my work has been released on great labels. Obviously, if they're happy with the mix downs, I should be, right? But I never am. And I think this is just a part of my creative sort of side, I guess.
But everybody feels that.
They do. It's totally normal.
Pretty much everybody I speak to on this podcast knows that to some degree.
It's totally normal. It's totally normal. And I think it's really important to remember that, particularly at those times where you do get a little bit obsessive and pedantic. You do have to be able to let things go and just get it out there. So the Lost Inventions project was essentially designed to not allow me to be perfectionistic. And one of the sort of systems that I designed for that was to sort of base it around live performance. And sort of almost adopting a bit of a dub reggae style kind of rough and ready approach to the way that it's produced and also the way that it's composed and performed. So that project is actually all built around essentially live performance. And what I did with the live performance sort of design, I guess, was deliberately remove the computer from the setup, which meant that I had to rely on much less in the way of being able to process things, being able to EQ and compress things, because in the live setup, I simply don't have the resources to be able to do that. So the whole live rig was designed to be very, very raw in its design, in basically how it's sort of built and that sort of stuff, and doesn't really allow me to get too perfectionistic because it's really not what the project is about. It's all about the vibe, and it's all about this sort of the sort of rawness and I guess the minimal way that it's been produced. It's very much a contrast to the Third Eye project and the way that it sort of all happens. So that project, because it's all sort of hardware focused, is absolutely essential to have an understanding of fairly complex sort of hardware MIDI concepts, I guess, being able to send program changes from the sort of main hardware sampler to be able to change all the presets for me from track to track within a live set, for example, is very important. Being able to remote control things, being able to sort of really sort of tap into the limitations of various different hardware samplers and sequencers using advanced MIDI stuff. There's often a lot more that you can actually get out of those devices if you can sort of figure out how to do it, if that makes sense.
Okay, so you're basically saying that besides the note on and off command and the velocity, there's an entire universe of other possibilities within the MIDI protocol. Absolutely,
and obviously if you're building a sort of hardware focused live rig, everything needs to be synchronized very tightly. You can't have any latency. In a live performance situation, you want everything to be stable and sort of easy to work with. And unfortunately, a lot of the sort of hardware that's designed for producing that style of music is often quite cryptic. I've got this phenomenal device called an electron digitact or digitact, which is my sort of brain for the hardware setup. And it's a lovely, quite cryptic, quite difficult to sort of learn the ropes of when you first get one. But that's the sort of brain that basically controls the entire set. It's got 8 sampler tracks, which means that I can load in my own samples and sort of, build the foundation of the track from there. But it's also got 8 MIDI tracks that I can use to send MIDI sort of percussion lines or melodies or bass lines to the other bits of hardware that I've got in the setup. And unfortunately, on a sort of, from a hands-on perspective, that little box, the Digitact, is actually really fiddly to use in a live setup because it's got a tiny little screen and all this, and I'm trying to do things like, dub out, sort of percussion using dub delays and stuff. And I have to obviously dive through menus on the device to actually find the settings. And it's not the most hands-on sort of environment. So
no, that's not user-friendly.
Not very user-friendly, particularly when you're on stage sweating and you can't really see what's going on and you've got an audience in front of you. The last thing that you want to be doing is diving through menus trying to find something. So a bunch of research later, and I found out a way of actually being able to control the Digitact using just like a standard MIDI controller with faders and being able to essentially remote control all of those parameters just using MIDI CC changes. So I've now got a system where I've got this little MIDI mixer which basically gives me the ability to control levels, filters and delay and reverb sends. And if it wasn't for a bunch of really nerdy digging through MIDI implementation charts and sort of Googling to try and find is it possible and what do I need to be able to do that, there's a lot of pretty nerdy fiddly MIDI stuff that you do have to get your head around. So I think certainly MIDI's still relevant. If you look at if you go on YouTube and look at, for example, the Fact Magazine Against the Clock series, which shows you sort of a whole bunch of different producers working in their studios, a lot of them are using fairly involved MIDI rigs even in their studios. So a lot of producers are still using a fusion of course the immediacy and the portability and the sort of endless possibilities of software-based production, but there's still very much a kind of cultural association with hardware. And I think to the newer generations of producers that missed that period of that sort of transition from purely hardware samplers, purely hardware drum machines, having to mix Detroit techno tracks on a 24 channel analog console. I think a lot of the younger generation don't realize the sort of legacy style production of where everything had to be done using hardware MIDI, and obviously how long that used to take.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So let me just sum that up. So you use program change commands?
Yeah, program change commands.
Do you actually have them at the press of a button using a MIDI hardware device?
It's actually coded into the sequence. So when I change a bank or a pattern on the hardware sampler to bring in a new element or to transition to a new track, it actually spits out all the program change messages as part of that sequence.
I see. So it's like automation in some ways.
Yeah.
It's all you practice in rehearsal, I guess.
Yes.
You practice all of this, and then your MIDI system knows when to do that for the next take.
Exactly.
And then you also use MIDI controllers. You mentioned volume and panning and reverb sense and echo sense.
Yes.
Like those.
Yes. Filter cutoff frequency as well. Of course.
And resonance. I guess.
Resonance as well.
And
to a lesser extent.
Controllers.
Yeah, exactly. To a lesser extent, things like modulation wheel can be useful for applying modulation live.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And what about tempo commands? Like MIDI beat clock, for example. Do you synchronize devices like echoes that way? Is that something you do as well?
I do actually, and it kind of varies on from rig to rig. So I think the current iteration of my live setup is probably like version 10 or something like that.
Right.
And it's always changing. I'm always working out ways of sort of improving it or streamlining it. But definitely. MIDI beat clock is essential. So everything is sort of synchronized using that. And then obviously that means having to dive into all the sub menus of all the devices and, assigning different MIDI channels and all this sort of stuff. So each thing's receiving its own designated parameters and this kind of stuff.
Of course.
Yeah.
MIDI channels.
MIDI channels.
That today, if you just work on a computer on a laptop, you might barely ever come across.
Hardly ever.
Hardly ever.
Yeah.
But using multi-timbral software or hardware, this becomes highly relevant.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right. So there's still, some use for the more complex elements of MIDI. So if we just look at this from a moment, you mentioned the old days of using hardware, and nowadays using software and plugins at all. It feels like it's a completely different thing. But if we just look under the hood, if you update your DAW and you go for the next latest one, they all still use the exact same MIDI protocol that was invented at the early 80s. So
yes.
The MIDI protocol has barely changed at all, yeah?
They've only just released version 2.0.
Yeah. Is that something? Have you looked into that?
I have, yes, and the new standard. So yeah, as you said, the version 1 of MIDI was released in 1983, and we've been using it all the way through that time until I think 2020 was when they announced MIDI 2.0. Which is pretty incredible. I mean, that's really testament to how well future-proofed the protocol was.
It might be the most successful music language ever. Well,
absolutely,
I guess, except from notation.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
But, as other digital standards, what digital standards do we use from the early 80s anymore?
Yeah.
Most of them are completely obsolete, but I don't think we have seen the best of MIDI yet. The best is probably still to come.
It's still to come. It's still to come. And obviously one of the biggest sort of developments as part of this MIDI 2.0 standard is MPE.
Please educate me. I have no idea what that is.
MPE. So, so basically, is it MIDI polyphonic expression or something like that? Anyway, MPE. Let's just call it MPE. You can edit that out. So MPE is a sort of new generation version of Aftertouch. So on a lot of sort of classic synthesizers, if you hold down a key, that will obviously trigger a note of a specific frequency. And with an Aftertouch enabled keyboard or synthesizer, without releasing the key, if you push down on it again, it sends a secondary MIDI message, which will then trigger some sort of change to the sound. So the most classic example of that, if you listen to Herbie Hancock, for example, or Dr. Dre, is using Aftertouch to trigger vibrato, so that the sort of pitch of the note has this like slight wobble effect. So you hear that in a lot of like lead synths from sort of classic G-funk and a lot of Herbie Hancock stuff, a lot of funk music. You can hear this all the way through it. And that's, again, using this Aftertouch to trigger an LFO to instigate this sort of slightly alternating pitch, which sounds a lot like vibrato that you'd get on a voice or a stringed instrument, for example. With MPE, it's a similar concept, but what you can now do is map 3 parameters to a MIDI controller's key, essentially. So what this means is that if you're using, for example, I've got a phenomenal device called the Polyend Dreadbox Medusa, which is a sort of hybrid analog digital synth, and it's also got an MPE-enabled sort of touch pad, like very similar to something like an Ableton Push that's got different sort of rubber pads that you can use to trigger drums or to trigger notes, right? It's essentially modeled on the push, but it's MPE enabled, which means that if I move my finger forward on the pad while I'm playing a note, that might trigger a filter to move. So I can actually control the filter cutoff frequency by rolling my finger back and forward as if you were taking a fingerprint, right? Not that I've ever had to do that, by the way.
Yeah, you say that now.
Except at immigration, that's the only time. So it's very much like taking a fingerprint. You can rock your finger back and forth, and that will trigger some sort of modulation. And again, you can also combine that with it's almost like an XY pad with some sort of horizontal movement as well. So if you rock your finger from side to side, that will actually generate an additional MIDI message that does something different. So just by which direction you move your finger in, you can basically control 2 parameters of the sound. So the most common one is vibrato, to allow you to sort of wiggle your finger on the pad, and that will instigate this vibrato effect, which is very, very similar to doing that on a guitar or on a stringed instrument. You wiggle your finger and it makes the vibrato effect. It's very, very similar. And in addition to those 2 parameters, you can also apply Aftertouch as well. So it's almost like a good way to think about it. It's almost like 3-dimensional sort of performance-based modulation. So for performers, that offers up it's a huge sort of range of creative options, and that actually will, I reckon, eventually change the way that people actually perform using sort of traditional interfaces like keyboards and sort of pad controllers. Yeah.
Wow.
A great development of that is the Roly series of controllers, like the Seaboard Rise, for example, which is almost like a kind of three-dimensional piano that can be programmed to give you, ways of manipulating music that you just couldn't normally do with a traditional piano keybed. So that, I think, is we're going to see a lot more of that sort of innovation in performance instruments, and sort of taking existing interfaces like the piano keyboard and the sort of Akai MPC style sort of pad control, and then using things like MPE to really maximize what you can do with that. Yeah.
Wow. So we're basically at a breaking point right now where the MIDI standard has been unaltered for decades.
Yes.
And just now we're at a turning point where all of this becomes, I guess, a future possibility.
I think so, yeah.
MIDI 2.0 standard has been released, and I believe that different DAW developers are now implementing this. I don't think it's on every DAW at this stage. So, but I'm sure that will change. And then, of course, it also needs the plugin and software developers to embrace this and build instruments with all these capabilities baked in.
Exactly.
So that will probably take, a long time, and would be curious. I'm very curious to find out more about what this actually looks like in real life. The possibilities are never ending. So
I think definitely within the field of sort of live performance, I think that yes, that's probably where we'll see the sort of biggest changes or the biggest developments in what we can do is with just new forms of input, I guess, for playing instruments. Yeah. MPE is built into Ableton now, so I think pretty much all the devices in Ableton you can set up MPE mapping for compatible controllers.
Okay.
That, I guess, is a limitation. There's not that many compatible controllers, but we will start to see more, and
will take time. Yeah.
It'll take time. They'll become cheaper and this kind of thing.
Are you aware about any other DAWs that have MIDI 2.0 built in at this stage?
I don't really know. I would imagine Bitwig does. Bitwig being you could say maybe the leader in innovation in the DAW realm at the moment in terms of what they're doing. They must have MPE built in, I would imagine.
Look, I might just do a little Google search. And once I find a resource, I'll add it to the show notes. So please refer to that.
Cool.
But it's definitely something that all DAWs at some stage will have to do, I guess, if they want to stay up to speed. That's really exciting.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow. Okay, and then of course it takes the performers to actually understand what can be done and to how to use this creatively. So you always bring it back to life, which I find is absolutely fascinating. One of the downsides of the old MIDI standard, especially when using hardware, is that MIDI timing is not always perfect. So for critical, drum programming, once it travels through a DIN5 MIDI cable, the timing could be hit and miss. So I believe that's probably also something they addressed, the bandwidth of the MIDI signal.
Yes, I believe that they have done that. So from a stability perspective, listen, you can have that debate with MIDI enthusiasts all day. Is it stable? Is it not stable? Yeah. I've got an acquaintance who actually used to build just completely bulletproof MIDI interfaces for live performance that just didn't drop any sync whatsoever. And he was telling me back in the day, he said, MIDI is actually pretty vulnerable in a sort of live performance realm because of stuff like latency and often missed messages not getting through, and obviously resulting in things like notes not playing, not stopping, or notes not playing back. So he actually said it's a lot less stable than you might think, which always sort of stuck with me. So in the version 2.0, I think they have, like you say, sort of actually increased what can be done with things like synchronization and that kind of stuff. But haven't really looked too much into that kind of thing. It's just mainly been MPE for me.
And if we now, start to dream about the future, if we think about what happened, in about 83 when MIDI first came out, it was nothing short of a musical revolution.
It was.
That shaped the sound of the 80s.
Changed everything.
And if we all have a clear idea of what that sound is. And then from there, it grew and grew and grew. And EDM, in the 2000s has become, probably the most popular genre. Is that fair to say?
That's
probably difficult to say, but I had no idea in the 90s how big EDM would become.
Yeah, sure.
I wouldn't have dreamed of that, in all honesty.
So EDM, if we
where's it going to stop?
Yeah, it's a good question.
With 2.0,
with 2.0,
it might just exponentially grow again.
Yeah, it's
Who
a
knows?
good point. Yeah, so I guess I think if you want to sort of define EDM as sort of encompassing all the electronic music genres, which is how a lot of people use that term as a sort of almost like an umbrella term for just all electronic music subgenres, then it's exploded to a point where it's just huge now. But it's always been kind of big. This is the thing. Like, and again, a lot of modern producers don't realize that, you know, even back in the sort of mid 90s, even techno producers and jungle producers, they were actually making lots of money from selling records because everything was on vinyl. So there was artists back then were actually making considerably more money from record sales than they do now. And that's a whole nother debate that maybe we shouldn't get into. But
I've got an episode on that.
Yeah,
nice
about
streaming services.
Cool.
I might just throw a link in the show notes again for that.
So obviously streaming services have certainly impacted on what we make from selling records. But back in the day, like a lot of sort of what would be classed underground music was actually shifting serious numbers of units. And I think genres like techno and house are you know, you could even argue that they were even bigger back in the day, you know. One of my sort of earliest memories of techno music, and I think this is where I fell in love with a lot of my favourite sort of electronic sounds, like one of my sort of signature sounds, I guess, is Third Eye would be the use of what would be called dub techno chords. So sort of basically minor triad chords made from synthesizers using filter envelopes, sawtooth waves, and then loads of delay and reverb on the top. The first time I heard that sound was actually on a song by it was called Big Fun, which was released as one of Kevin Saunderson's projects, him being one of the sort of pioneers of Detroit techno, and that got into the top 10 in the UK in the 80s. You know, it was you know, a lot of these techno artists were actually shifting serious units, but now we've reached a point where a lot of pop artists, I guess, are sort of drawing from these underground electronic music styles and sort of using them as their main instrumentation. You know, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm very excited to see what the future brings.
Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. Who knows? You know, everything is possible. And whatever it is going to be big. That's my prediction, at least. So let's see.
Absolutely.
Let's see.
And I think as well, another thing that we're going to see more of is obviously using stuff like Wi-Fi. Within sort of MIDI networking and this kind of stuff, which we're already seeing with things like Ableton Link, where you can synchronize the BPM of two different laptops running Ableton just over a wireless network. So actually sort of firing the beat clock out over Wi-Fi. So I think we'll definitely see more of that stuff, which will increase what can be done for sure. Yeah.
At that time of the interview, we shifted the focus towards mixing and creative work. And because that went on for a lot longer than I expected, I decided that I would like to split this interview in half. So this actually concludes the first part, where we basically spoke about MIDI, the origins and the future. And then we are going to continue this interview next week in part 2, when we get into the really good and juicy stuff, all the creative mindsets, James's mixing secrets, how that's different between EDM, acoustic music, and so on, and just some amazing stuff that just opened my mind and knocked my socks off. So James has got so much more to share. Tune in next time again when we continue this interview. In the meantime, please check out the show notes if you want to know more about James and his music. And I also added a couple of extra links about things that we discussed in this episode. If you want to reach out to me, you can do this via Facebook on the Production Talk Podcast Community Facebook group. Join in, become a member, and meet like-minded people. If you ever need any help finishing your project, you can also reach out to me on my website, mixartist.com.au. There's a contact form. I would love to hear about you and your music. I'm very curious to see what you're up to. And if you need any help, I would be delighted to give you some advice and point you in the right direction. Okay, good. This is all for now. I hope you have a fantastic week, and definitely tune in next week when we continue this interview with Mr. James Lyall. Bye for now.